I know a lot of you are probably wondering why the heck am I even talking about this? It's another random JavaScript backend thing, and you're probably right. But there is a lot here. And I want to talk about today, A, what is Hono? B, why would you use it? C, why am I talking about it? D, I want to go over some actual real life examples. I built out 2 full example applications with this. One of them is using sveltekit and Hono, which again, I'll explain what that means later. The other is using Astro and Hono, so the new AstroDB system, and the API is being wrapped with Hono. And then finally, I kind of want to lead all of this into a discussion about A, the reason I wanted to use this in the first place, the reason I'm even talking about this, which is for a project that I'm working on right now and figuring out how to architect that. And also just kind of a more broad discussion about server-side JavaScript and how all this stuff actually works. Because there is, as I've been going through and making this video and making the demos for this, there has been a lot of stuff that's come up that I think is really worth talking about. There's so much nuance and complexity in API routes and server-side rendering and load functions and RSCs and all these different things. It gets very weird and the lines get very blurry. And while I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, I just kind of want to walk you guys through how I'm sort of feeling about this stuff and what I'm kind of thinking right now. So yeah, without further ado, what the heck is Hono? So Hono is well, as it says here, it's a lightweight, fast backend framework for JavaScript. It's very similar to Fastify or Express or any of these normal backend JavaScript frameworks that you would use. But what's really nice about this one, it is really lightweight, which means that we can run it anywhere on basically any runtime and also in any framework. And that is a really cool thing we can do with this, and one of the reasons why I want to talk about it. So I think really the best place to start with how this actually works and what this even is to show you one of the first example applications I built, which is going to be in sveltekit. So like I said, I think the best place to really begin with what this even is to illustrate this in a real example application. So Hono is a backend web server. We are using that for the backend for this little to-do app. I know, very original. I made way too many of these things, but it's a great way to illustrate the concept, so whatever. The way I built this was with sveltekit, the way I normally build things, but what you'll notice here that's kind of weird is within my roots directory here, I have this API. This API is spreading the slugs, and then what it's doing here is in this server.ts, it's going through and exposing a get request, a put request, a delete request, and a post request for this little app.fetch thing. So what the heck is this app.fetch? Well, this is actually a full Hono web server. We go into lib/api/index.ts, you'll see that this is a full Hono web server, which is being mounted and run through my sveltekit backend. And we can do this in Next.js, in Nuxt.js, in Astro, which is the other example, which we'll talk about later. And we can also obviously do this through sveltekit. So what we can do here is we can create a real quote-unquote backend within our sveltekit app, which can set up and serve HTTP handlers in a kind of traditional way. We can go through and have our to-dos routes here and set this up in a way that would be very familiar to someone who's writing Express. We can go through and do a bunch of different stuff there. This whole thing was kind of inspired by and was built off of a template which someone in my community made. Shout out here to Hono. He did a great job building out this template for the sveltekit Bring Your Own Backend. I went ahead and modified it a little bit and created my own version. I called it Bring Your Own Backend Slim, because while he did a fantastic job here building out a full, richly featured API with a bunch of different stuff here, personally, I don't really vibe with the way he made a lot of this stuff in here. If you go into like the API, you'll see it's very MVC-like. He uses a lot of controllers. He uses a lot of controllers and modules and all these things. And while this is, I've seen this before. I've done work in Spring Boot. I've done work in Nest.js. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of it. I don't like having this much boilerplate. I totally understand there are places where you might want to, I'll zoom in here. I totally understand that there are places where you might want to build stuff like this, and in bigger teams and bigger apps, totally makes sense. And if you want to do that, check out this template down below. He does a fantastic job of setting all of this stuff up and doing a great job of showing it in the real world. It's just not for me. I personally much prefer, instead of going through and doing a full like authentication controller and user controller and wrapping everything in a bunch of modules and injecting things and doing all this stuff, I just kind of, I don't know, I just go in my to-dos route and we just call get user to-dos, which is just a database function. Like, I like to keep it simple. Maybe this will bite me in the ass and maybe I'm totally wrong about this. Feel free to disagree with me in the comments. But for me personally, especially for the stuff I'm building at the scale I'm building, I like to keep things simple. So like I said, I went ahead and built out my own little version of this, built a to-do app. We created some endpoints here for our to-dos. We created some endpoints here for our users. The authentication is being run with Lucia. I've made ton of videos about that, kind of by accident, honestly. That sort of just was happenstance with this channel very much ends up being stream of consciousness. And for the last 3 months, I've been in the early stages of a bunch of projects, so auth has really been on my mind. So that's kind of how that happened. And right now you can kind of see we're doing architecting things. So you'll get a lot more architecting content for the next couple weeks here. But yeah, so we went ahead and used Lucia for the authentication here. And like I said, it's a basic REST API. We can call things from API/users. You can see here in my little API client here, if I make a GET request to localhost 5173/API, I'm going to get server as healthy, and that is being served through this GET request here on my app. So again, it's just an HTTP server that's being mounted and served through my sveltekit app. And that's neat, but that leads to the question, okay, why the heck would you do this? Why would you not put this out somewhere separate? And why would you pick Hono specifically for this? And one of the reasons is because Hono has access to a feature called RPC. And if you ever use tRPC, this is going to look and feel very familiar to you, and I'm a huge fan of it. What we can do here is if we go and take a look at my to-dos endpoints here, or not my to-dos endpoints, if we look at my page.server within the to-dos directory, we can see I have this little locals.api.todos.get. We can query our Hono backend via a type-safe RPC wrapper. So we can use locals.api.todos.get, and we get this beautiful type-safe wrapper. If we do locals.api. We get users and to-dos, or if we just did get here, let's just do get here, and then we just did const res 2 equals await this, and then we do we just do res 2 equals that, and then we hover over this guy. You're going to see it's going to give us a client response with message string. So we get full end-to-end type safety and the ability to call our backend functions from our front end really easily. So we can create a separate backend and then call those with type safety on our front end, which is really cool. It's a really sweet thing you can do there. To actually set this up, it's trivial. All you have to do is create a little Hono client here, and I just do that within my hooks.server.ts. We just do Hono client app type and then set all that stuff up. I've linked the documentation down below. This isn't going to be a tutorial. The last 2 days, I've done a bunch of streams going over actually showing off building these things and building these little examples. So if you want to get more context, go check those out. For right now, it just kind of works. We have our dedicated standalone Hono backend, which is a normal backend web server. We can put middlewares in there, services in there, all the different things you'd want to do. And then we have our sveltekit app. And we can even go ahead and host this Hono server separately. Josh Tried Coding has a great video on this. I'll link it down below. But he went ahead and did something pretty similar to this where you can host certain parts of your apps separately. So you can go through and I could host this API directory, host this Hono server in like Cloudflare workers, and then host the rest of my app in Vercel so that I get the benefits of Vercel, but also the performance of Cloudflare workers for my backend. Or maybe we were in a case where I wanted to have like a persisting database connection, or we needed to do something with like WebSockets and serverless wouldn't work. So then it would make a ton of sense to host this in like a static Kubernetes cluster or some shit like that. And then the rest of our app can get deployed to a nice serverless environment. So there's a lot of really cool stuff we can do here. Now, all of that sounds really cool, and it is really cool, but ultimately I found that this example was not the greatest use case and showcase of how this can actually work and how I would actually use this in the real world. It is very cool that we can go ahead in this page.server.ts and just call locals.api.todos.get and get all of our to-dos out from our Hono API with the type safety. But the problem you're going to run into here, and if any of you guys have seen my old videos, you've seen me run into this real time. Yes, I can do this. Yes, I can do it this way. I can also just go ahead and get my to-dos another way and just remember when I showed off this locals.api.todos.get method earlier, and I was just calling this get user to-dos. Well, this page.server.ts also runs on the server, so I can just call that get user to-dos function right here. We don't have to do this separate function. So basically all we're doing here, if all we were building was just a basic sveltekit app and all we needed to do was serve data from our sveltekit app, this would create a lot of boilerplate and redundancy that doesn't need to exist. And that's something I'm really trying to do personally in my projects and in the things I'm working on, is I want to get rid of as much redundancy as possible. And I also want to just reduce the friction between me and actually building the thing that's useful. I did a horrible job architecting some of the projects I've worked on in the past where I would have all these separate backends. I would do all the big clean architecture things, and then it would just end up blowing up in my face because if I wanted to make one little change, I'd have to change it in 7 different places and do a bunch of different things and spin up and down a ton of different services. And it was just a nightmare. But if the way I'm doing it is on my to-dos page, I just need to load my data out of a little basic function, which is talking directly to my database. And the friction between me and making a bug fix and me and adding a feature is literally just updating this one function, getting my types updated. If I screwed something up with the types, I get red lines down here. I can fix everything really quickly, easily, run all my scripts, send it up to the server, done. That is so much better for me than having to go through and create this, create more complexity for myself internally, which I really just don't want to do. So ultimately, I kind of found like, well, this doesn't feel like too great of a solution for my own. This doesn't feel like too great of a solution for the projects I'm building where I just need a sveltekit app. I just need a web app. I don't think I'm going to end up using this. For the Insider Viz rebuild, I don't think we're going to use this for the majority of our app. So that led me over to Astro, and a community member, another one who's in the stream, shout out to Asker, made this nice little Astro full stack example. And I took this and I went ahead and I actually built this into a more complete example application. So this is the example we built out with Astro. It's kind of an atrocity. It's not a great application, but it's really just to showcase an email list. This is not production ready. Obviously, don't put this in the real world. We expose the email list here. There's no validation. It's just literally taking whatever you put in that box and putting it into the email list table and then printing out the email list table. This isn't a real application. It's to illustrate the concepts. But this ended up being a great showcase of how to use Hono in a real sort of project. Because remember, like what I said, we can use Hono and mount it into any full stack JS frameworks backend. All of these frameworks expose like a normal REST API type thing. They expose like a plus server.ts or a route.js or whatever they do in Next.js. I don't know off the top of my head. All these frameworks allow us to mount Hono into them, and that can allow for a much better experience in some of these frameworks. I think the framework that benefits from this most is Astro, because Astro, I've used this in the past. I really like it. I'm actually, I've used this more and more. I've been using Astro more and more lately, and honestly, I'm kind of a huge fan of the stuff they're doing. I think they're doing a really good job, and I actually have this in production several times. I've got multiple Astro sites in production. I'm going to have more. Blog sites, landing pages, marketing pages, content-driven stuff is phenomenal in Astro, and it really does feel great to develop in, but that's kind of a side tangent. I also really like their database offering, which I made a video about that recently, so check that out if you haven't already. So anyways, all that stuff aside, the biggest problem I have with Astro is their endpoints kind of suck because they're just normal JS endpoints. I've been spoiled by Next.js and sveltekit and Vue and all these different, or Nuxt and all these frameworks, to where I don't like it when I have to write a normal GET request, and TRPC as well. I don't like it when I have to go and write a normal GET request, or I have to write a normal POST request, and I have to use HTTP verbs like we did back in the MERN stack days. That's how I started programming. I was making HTTP requests from my SPA React app to my Express.js backend, and it did work. It's totally fine, but I don't like that. I much prefer being able to have my little page.server.ts load function and then go onto my page.svelte and be able to say data equals props and grab that out with end-to-end type safety, get all the benefits of server-side rendering and all these crazy things that we're able to do with these new frameworks, which I just don't see talked about enough. And Astro allows us to do the same thing on the fetching side, but at least from what I've seen, and totally correct me if I'm wrong. If I've missed something here, let me know. I hope I'm wrong. But for Astro, whenever I went ahead and had to like send something to my email list or post something to the database, the only way we could really do that is to go into our pages directory, to create some endpoints.ts and to create a handler and do all this stuff. And it works, but it's just kind of bleh. At least for me personally, I'm not a huge fan. But Hono here and its RPC feature makes a ton of sense. What we can do, so I can go ahead, I have, just like we did in sveltekit, I have this path.ts, and basically all I'm doing is I'm just mounting my Hono application into all these HTTP verbs. And if we go into lib/API, you're going to see once again a Hono application. We are mounting it to the API path. We have a set of routes that are emails, and then we also have our app.get at the root of API to say server is healthy. If we go over here and I switch this to 4321 because all these frameworks have different port numbers because they're cute, and we hit this, we will still get server is healthy. So it works perfectly fine. It's a normal backend API mounted into our Astro app, which is great. So what I can do here, I create my email endpoints here, so I have my ability to get all the emails off of the email list, and I also have the ability to add to the email list. We go into the components here. I think I called it email collect. If If you look at this guy right here, this is a React component. I used React for the components in my Astro app. I kind of just end up doing that most of the time these days. I don't know why I default to it, but it just feels right. I like Svelte better, but I just default to React. I don't know if that's a character flaw or something, but I just do. I went ahead and created this little component where we can put in your email, we set the value, and then on submit, we fire the submit function. And this is normally where you would run like a fetch request to /API/emails, and then make a post request, pass in some data, do all the things, get the response back, serialize the JSON, do all the stuff. It's kind of a pain in the ass. Instead here, all I had to do is just api.emails.post, pass in some JSON of email. I get type safety on my inputs because it's RPC, and the type safety is defined right here within this Z validator, which is a super great experience. And then I can create this API client in my little client.ts thing here, where I go ahead and just create a new Hono client, pass in my app type. You don't have to override fetch because, to my knowledge, Astro doesn't override fetch. I think, again, fact check me on that, But yeah, that's all we have to do to actually post something to our backend. And that's a much better user experience, or that's a much better developer experience than running the fetch. So that ended up making a ton of sense. But if you were watching the stream yesterday, you probably saw that this whole thing flew together in about 40 minutes. I mean, it was no time to get this email list up and running. The database was trivial and a breeze to work with because it's AstroDB, super baked into the framework, super easy to use, drizzle out of the box, great stuff. Getting the Hono set up, also super trivial, did not take long to do. The actual components, I just used AI to generate them because I don't want to make a landing page header. So all of this stuff was super easy to do. But we ended up running into a big problem here when I was trying to, when I was trying to deploy this, because I was trying to call my API endpoints from the backend, from the server. And this is where we get into the really tricky conversation of where the heck do things even run anymore in JavaScript land, and the blurring of the lines between client and server, and really what I wanted to talk about in this video, which is really just going to be kind of my musings on server-side JavaScript and how all this stuff feels and how we can use all these different things, because it's different. And I get a lot of comments and I see a lot of things, and I think a lot of people kind of misunderstand this. So I kind of want to talk about at least the way I think about it and the way I understand it. And the best way to do that will be to start with an example. So what was the problem that I ran into? So what I was doing is on my index.astro here. Now we're doing it correctly. And all we're doing here is we're just loading our emails in. These little dots at the top, all of this up here, you can think of this, if any of you are from the PHP era, this is very similar to putting a PHP tag up at the top of your file. And basically, this will all run server-side on mount. And the reason it'll run server-side, in my astro.config, I'm saying output is server, which means that every time we go to one of these pages, it's going to be server-side rendered, which basically means, at least in my head, this is really kind of just a load function for our Astro content. We can call a separate backend or do whatever, but what I ended up doing is I was calling my own backend here from the server. What I was doing is I was making a call, I was initializing the Hono client, and I was making a call to that. And the way I had to do that was I had to initialize the Hono client, and then I had to provide an absolute URL to it. So I won't go into details about all the problems that we ran into, but basically what I was doing is I was calling my own backend from my own backend, which is a tricky and weird place to be. And ultimately, the solution for this ended up being just directly calling db.select from up here, and then from the client side of things, going ahead and running. And then on the client side of things, within my email collect component, which is all run client side, we can just go ahead and do api.emails.post and run all that. So I put this little note on my client.ts file here, that note, this can only be run on the client. And I think, honestly, this whole concept really needs to be visualized for me. This really needs to be visualized in order for me to give my real thoughts on this. So to really write out what the modern JS application looks like these days, let's just use a sveltekit app as an example here. Let's start over here and let's draw a line here. And we're just going to make this the boundary between client and server. So I'm going to say everything down here is the client, and then everything up here is going to be the server. So when we go ahead and we create our Hono app, when we create our Hono backend, that is squarely going to live up here. We're just going to call this Hono. And this is squarely going to live within our backend. We're going to mount it to we're going to mount this to, let's just add some information here. We're going to mount this to /API. So this is all squarely on the server. Then down here, we're going to have our little plus page.svelts. And these are going to be run on the client. Now, again, there's some nuance here, which is really tricky, that these page.svelts are actually server-side rendered unless you specifically say that they're going to be client-side rendered. So to use this as an example, this to-dos page is actually going to get run on the server before it's exposed and run on the client. So this effect will not be run on the server because it runs on mount effectively, but all of this data will be run server-side instead of just client-side. So there is some more nuance there, but generally speaking, for the sake of argument, we can just say everything in page.svelte is client-side land, and we don't need to worry too much about it. So we're just going to say that. Then where this gets interesting and tricky is going to be, we also have server-side. We have our little load functions here. So we have our we have our load functions, and we're going to call this plus page.server.ts. These are also run server-side. And this is where we can fetch our data down to our page.svelte. We can do a bunch of different things. And everything up here on the server is going to talk to our database. So we're just going to call this over here. This is going to be our DB. So generally speaking, in most of the applications I end up building, and especially the stuff you're going to be building on, and generally speaking, in most applications, you're going to have some sort of database, and you're going to have to talk to that through some backend layer. And the point I've been trying to get across over the last couple months is that we can now talk to this database from more places than just a dedicated backend API. We can talk to this database from our load functions, from our server actions, from our React server components. Because if we were using Next.js as an example here, we could call an RSC one of the, we just replace this with RSC and it'd be the same thing. So what ended up happening, and like I kind of alluded to in the example before, in this to-dos example, this initial res parse API response, locals.api.todos.get, all these things, what's actually happening here is the flow of data is we're going from this load function, we are calling our Hono API, then we're going to our database, then we're going back to our Hono API, then we're going back to our load function, then we're finally going down to our page.svelte. And if you want to put this elsewhere and you want to host this elsewhere and there's a reason for that, that makes a ton of sense. If you wanted to put this guy on Cloudflare Workers and you wanted to put this guy on Vercel, that makes a ton of sense. But in a lot of cases, you don't really need to do that. And we can just cut the middleman. And for sake of argument, for those of you who have been watching for a while, let's just imagine this is a Golang or some separate other backend framework or language or whatever. We can just cut the middleman and go directly to our database. And the way I illustrated this here is with this getUserToDos function. We can just create this getUserToDos function within, I think I did within lib db data. Yeah, I made a little data directory in here. So we can create a bunch of little functions back here, which will all run server side. And we can call these functions in our Hono API. We can also call these functions in our load function, which means that you don't necessarily need to have this separate backend API to fetch this stuff down. And in the Astro example, the problem we were running into was we were fetching the data we were basically doing that exact same thing in the load function, calling the Hono client. But the problem was we were using a relative path to get the URL to the Hono client, because on the client, you can do that. You can say /API/todos, and that will go to the right endpoint if you call that client side. But you call that server side, you need to use the absolute URL. We were having problems getting the absolute URL to work and a bunch of environment variables crap, and it was just a pain. So basically what we ended up settling on is we could just go ahead and get it out of this API, but instead, let's just go directly to the database within this and then run it that way. So that's what we ended up doing. So this has been a very long way of saying, well, when and why would I ever want to use this separate API or to have this separate thing? And the answer to that, to me, is when you need to expose separate API endpoints or you want to host it separately. We've already talked about the hosting it separately thing. And the reason why I want to use Hono and I care about having this backend API that's a real backend API is for this app I'm building, Block. For those of you who aren't aware, mobile apps do not have servers in the same way web apps do. This is not being server-side rendered. This is being sent down to the end user's device, downloaded from the App Store, and this has to make API calls to a backend. Initially, the way I architected this was to use the Supabase client SDK to do all my database work and connect directly to a Postgres instance that way, handled my auth, handled my storage, and it kind of worked, but we quickly realized like, hey, this is not going to scale super well. I don't really love the architecture of this. It got to be kind of a huge pain. And I'm like, yeah, especially since we needed a lot of background workers and we need a lot of background syncing to ensure the calendar functionality and all of the linking functionality is updated properly. I'm like, yeah, we need a real dedicated backend for this. So we went ahead, and so at that point, I was like, okay, now I'm in the market for a separate REST API backend. And this is kind of a first for me. This is a place where I needed to be able to create a standalone backend for my app. I needed to be able to expose /API and actually make normal HTTP requests. And I looked at a bunch of different things and ultimately ended up deciding that, yeah, I think Hono makes a ton of sense for this because A, I can mount this into literally whatever I want. I can deploy this wherever I want. I can put it wherever I want. I can handle it basically however I want to. And B, it has really great support for a lot of the features that I wanted to see. So one of the things that I really wanted when I was designing out the dedicated backend for this application is I wanted really good documentation for my API routes. When you're working with something like TRPC or load functions in sveltekit or RSCs or whatever, you basically get auto documentation through the type safety. But we're not going to be able to get as much type safety. Now, probably later on, I might get cute with it and architect this into a mono repo and run all those RPC functions I showed off earlier on the client and get a really great experience there. And yeah, as I'm saying that out loud, I really want to do that. So shit, that might be what I do later today. But anyways, that aside, what we can do here is Hono has really great support for a bunch of different third-party libraries. And one of the really important ones is Swagger UI. This is something I ended up using at work last year, and it ended up being a huge boon to the team. I was working as the standalone backend developer for a mobile app. I had a team. There was a couple other people working on the dedicated mobile client for it, and I used Swagger UIs to generate documentation for them. You can see over here, I've started working on this. I only have some basic routes here. I mean, this is very much in progress, but we have some endpoints here like this get. So we can say whenever we go to API/the root of API, we're going to be able to get back a status of string. And all of this documentation is being generated through the OpenAPI SDK for Hono. So I can create a new OpenAPI Hono. I can go ahead and create a bunch of routes here. I can define the structure of my health check route. I can say it's going to be a GET request at the root path. It's going to have these responses. I can go ahead and then just run all this stuff down here, and it will just spit out this documentation. And if I went into my little HTTP client one last time, I can go ahead, make a GET request to API, and we're going to get server is healthy. And that's all documented right here. So this is going to be super helpful for making sure that as I work on the back end, I've got some guys working on the front end right now, we can ensure that we have a good contract back and forth and they can see what's happening. I'm also probably going to utilize the RPC features here because that seems like a really good idea. Put that in a mono repo. I don't know how React Native is going to behave in a mono repo. That might fucking suck, but we'll see. I don't know. That's a problem for tomorrow. But regardless, this is sort of what I wanted. I wanted a dedicated backend, and Hono ended up being the dedicated backend that I picked. And you'll notice here, getting even more kind of out of pocket, this is a sveltekit application. My backend for this app is going to be a sveltekit app. I'm going to run the API for this project in a serverless instance in a sveltekit application. And I think it's going to work really, really well. I'm very excited about this. It's kind of different. It's kind of new. But yeah, I think this is going to be I think this is going to work really well. I'm very excited. It's going to get a lot of the DX. It's going to get the serverless power. It's going to get all these things. I'm very happy. This is very much what this kind of all led to. We can just make all these, we can export, we can expose all these endpoints. I'm going to set the runtime config to be edge, host these on Vercel, get super cheap requests on the edge network, probably use like Terso or PlanScale for the database so I can run them in the edge network and just make this stuff work. So yeah, that is basically how I'm thinking and feeling about Hono and a lot of full stack JS things right now. This probably ended up being an extremely long video. I'll have to cut this down a lot and see what this turns into. But yeah, if you guys found this helpful, make sure you like and subscribe. I'll have much more to talk about in these projects coming soon. I'm going to end up having a dedicated sveltekit app in production probably next week, which will be the Insider Viz V2 thing. That's going to be super dope. We have like the best data set on the market now. I cannot wait for that to go live. probably sometime later this summer, Block is going to go live. That will be a full React Native app with this weird Hono sveltekit backend thing. So we'll have that to talk about. I've got a couple more unannounced projects that I'm working on, which will probably be more a lot of standalone sveltekit apps, just doing full stack stuff there. We've got many Astro sites going out. We've got the Block app site right now. We're gonna have the new Insider Viz blog. I'm probably gonna put my personal on there. Just a lot of things are getting built right now, and I don't know. I know a lot of you guys, if you're watching this far, then you're probably pretty invested. So thank you. But a lot of you guys probably are. I know a lot of people are not happy that I'm not talking about Go and doing a bunch of stuff with that. But I honestly, at this point, I'm just kind of following what I'm excited about and what I'm enjoying. And hopefully it's pretty obvious through this long video and all these things I'm talking about. This is kind of the stuff I'm enjoying right now. I'm having a really good time actually getting stuff built with these full stack JS things. I think there is so much potential here. I think people are sleeping on this so hard. We had a huge resurgence of this. We had a huge surge of this like 2 years ago with the TRPC thing. That was awesome. But I think I want to help make a new wave of this. I want to get more. I really want to show off the power of what you can do here. I want to make real stuff, and I want to show just how far this can go and how good this stuff can get. So that's the ambition. That's what we're going to be doing. I will talk to you guys soon.